The HOA president called the cops on me for trespassing in my own backyard, which was honestly her first and last big mistake, because she had absolutely no clue she was picking a fight with a municipal judge who could shut down her entire corrupt little empire with a single stroke of a pen. There I was just after 9 on a sweltering Saturday morning, sweat stinging my eyes as I wrestled with a heavy cedar post in that unforgiving Texas heat, and the rhythmic, metallic clang of my post-hole digger was the only thing echoing through the quiet streets of Oakhaven Ridge until suddenly the air was shattered by that unmistakable end quote, whoop whoop end quote, of a police siren. I watched, leaning on my shovel with dirt caked under my fingernails, as 3 squad cars screamed into my gravel driveway, tires crunching like broken glass, while behind them, a pristine white Lexus SUV pulled up with the kind of smug, predatory grace you'd expect from a shark in a suburban driveway. Out stepped Margaret end quote, Maggie end quote, Thorne, 49 years old and the self-appointed queen of Oakhaven for nearly a decade, standing there with her arms crossed over her designer blouse, practically vibrating with a twisted sense of satisfaction as she pointed a manicured finger at me while the officers stepped out of their cruisers with that familiar, wary hand-on-belt stance they always take when they think they're walking into a volatile situation. What Maggie didn't and oppose, T realized in that moment, and what would eventually become the centerpiece of a federal fraud case, was that for the last 6 months, I'd been quietly building a dossier on her that would make a seasoned prosecutor blush, and her little power trip this morning was about to become Exhibit A in her own downfall. My name's Arthur Vance, and I've sat on the bench for over 20 years, seeing every kind of small-town drama and petty criminal you can imagine, but nothing quite prepares you for the sheer, unadulterated ego of a suburban HOA president who thinks she's above the law. I'd moved into Oakhaven Ridge looking for a fresh start after a messy divorce that left me wanting nothing but a quiet corner lot, a place to set up my woodworking shop, and maybe a little peace of mind while I tinkered with old mahogany planks. At first, the neighborhood seemed like a dream with its manicured lawns, the sweet scent of blooming jasmine in the air, and the sound of kids actually playing outside in a way you don into Oppos. TC much anymore. And at $190 a month in dues, I figured the HOA was just there to make sure nobody painted their house neon pink or left a rusted-out Camaro on blocks in the front yard. That illusion of suburban bliss lasted exactly 3 weeks until the day I replaced my mailbox, which had been smashed to splinters by a neighborhood kid with a baseball bat, with an identical model I'd picked up at the local hardware store. Same height, same color, same everything. Yet within 48 hours, I found a thick manila envelope on my porch that hit the wood like a legal grenade. The violation notice inside was a masterpiece of bureaucratic absurdity, claiming I'd made an, end quote, unapproved exterior modification, end quote, and slapping me with a $200 fine that would escalate by $50 every single day until I attended a compliance hearing. And as a man who spends his days reading legal briefs, I could tell right away this document had more holes in it than a block of Swiss cheese. I pulled out the original 1980s HOA bylaws, the real ones, not the edited, end quote, summary, end quote, Maggie handed out, and searched every single page, but there wasn't an Oppos. A word about mailbox replacement procedures, and when I took a walk around the block, I saw at least a dozen mailboxes that were clearly newer than mine with 0 violation notices stuck to their posts. That's when my neighbor, a grizzled electrician named Silas who'd lived in the neighborhood since the first brick was laid, wandered over with a cold beer and a bitter laugh to tell me that I'd officially been, end quote, thorned, end quote, which was the local term for when Maggie decided you were a threat to her social order and marked you for financial destruction. He told me horror stories about Mrs. Gable at number 12 being fined into a lien because she dared to plant blue hydrangeas instead of the, end quote, approved, end quote, white ones, and a young couple who were hounded out of the neighborhood because they dared to question why the community pool hadn't and Oppos. T been cleaned in 3 years despite the massive budget we were supposedly paying for. The pattern was as clear as a bell to someone with my training. Maggie systematically targeted anyone who was professional, anyone who was new, or anyone who dared to ask where the money was going, and as a judge, my first instinct is always to follow the money trail. I submitted a formal, certified request for 3 years of HOA financial records, a right guaranteed to every homeowner under state law, And Maggie's response was a masterclass in stonewalling, filled with excuses about, end quote, digitization issues, end quote, and, end quote, privacy concerns, end quote, that would have made a corrupt politician proud. When I finally cornered her in the tiny, pine-scented HOA office that smelled like a mix of cheap air freshener and desperation, she made me wait nearly 30 minutes while she pretended to be busy with a filing cabinet, eventually looking up with a smile that didn't end oppose. T reach her eyes and calling me, end quote, sweetie, end quote, in a way that felt like being poked with a hot needle. She told me that here in Oak Haven, they followed, end quote, community standards, end quote, not courtroom rules, and she had this unnerving habit of leaning over her desk, her heavy floral perfume cloying in the air, tried to intimidate me with the sheer weight of her self-importance while I sat there quietly taking notes, the click of my pen clearly setting her teeth on edge. By the time I decided to build that privacy fence, I knew I was walking into a trap, but I'd done my homework, hiring a professional surveyor to mark my property lines with bright orange GPS-verified flags and pulling every municipal permit required by the city. So when I started digging that Saturday morning, I was ready for the showdown. Maggie emerged from her Lexus like a general approaching a battlefield, armed with a dollar store measuring tape and a look of pure, unadulterated venom, screaming that my fence was encroaching on, end quote, HOA common area, end quote, despite the fact that I was 6 inches inside my own property line. She didn't oppose, care about the survey or the permits. She just wanted to flex her muscles in front of the neighbors who were beginning to gather on their porches to watch the spectacle. And when she realized I was an oppose, gonna back down or get angry, she made the fatal error of calling the police and lying through her teeth, claiming I was, end quote, trespassing and destroying community assets, end quote. Watching Sergeant Miller, an officer who'd been in my courtroom dozens of times, step out of his cruiser and look from Maggie's frantic, pointing finger to my calm face was one of the most satisfying moments of my career, especially when he walked over and said, end quote, morning, Your Honor, everything okay here, end quote. And I saw the color drain from Maggie's face until she looked like she'd seen a ghost. She tried to double down, shrieking that she didn't and oppose. Care who I was and that the law didn't and oppose. Apply to, end quote, judicial bullies, end quote. But Miller just looked at my paperwork, looked at her trespassing on my lawn, and told her in no uncertain terms that if she didn't and oppose, stepped back onto the sidewalk, he'd be the one arresting her for a false report. She retreated to her Lexus, heels clicking sharply against the pavement like gunfire. But I knew this was an end oppose. Over. And as she peeled away, leaving a trail of exhaust and wounded pride, I felt the gears of the legal system finally beginning to grind in my favor. The following weeks were a whirlwind of escalating insanity as Maggie launched a full-scale, end quote, scorched earth, end quote, campaign against me, sending me violation notices for everything from my grass being a quarter-inch too long to my garden hose being, end quote, improperly coiled, end quote, totaling nearly $1,000 in fines in a single week. She even went so far as to file a frivolous restraining order against me in the neighboring county, claiming I was using my, end quote, judicial influence, end quote, to stalk her, which was a move so bold and so stupid it actually made me laugh, because it forced the entire dispute into a real courtroom, where she couldn't and oppose, hide behind HOA bylaws. Walking into that hearing felt like stepping on a home turf, even though I was sitting at the defendant's table, and when Maggie's high-priced attorney, a man who clearly charged more per hour than his client could afford, tried to paint me as a rogue judge, my friend Judge Patricia Sterling, who's known me since law school, looked at the evidence of Maggie's harassment and nearly threw her gavel at the woman. Patricia not only denied the restraining order, but sanctioned Maggie's lawyer for filing a meritless case, ordering the HOA to pay my legal fees, which was a victory that tasted sweeter than any vintage scotch I've ever owned. But the real breakthrough came at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, when I was sitting in my home office surrounded by stacks of yellowed papers I'd pulled from the county archives, and I found it. Section 14, paragraph 3 of the original 1980s incorporation charter that Maggie and her cronies had conveniently, end quote, forgotten, end quote, to include in the modern handbook. It was a, end quote, nuclear option, end quote, clause, a safeguard built in by the original developers that stated if any board member was ever convicted of a crime involving a breach of fiduciary duty, the entire board would be automatically dissolved and the HOA would be placed under county receivership until new elections could be held. It was the end quote, Death Star end quote, flaw I'd been looking for, and it was perfectly timed because my friend Janet, a forensic accountant who could find a missing penny in a haystack, had just finished her audit of the HOA's bank records that I'd subpoenaed through the prosecutor's office. The numbers were staggering, showing a systematic embezzlement scheme that had bled the community of over $150,000 over the last 5 years, with money being funneled through, end quote, Pinnacle Property Services, end quote, and right into Maggie's personal accounts to fund a lifestyle, her failing real estate business, Kuden and Oppos, T-Support. We found invoices for pool repairs that never happened, landscaping for common areas that were actually just Maggie's own backyard, and end quote, legal fees, end quote, that were actually just her personal credit card bills. And as I sat there in the quiet of the night, watching the printer spit out page after page of incriminating data, I realized I was and Oppos. Just defending my fence anymore. I was liberating 147 families from a parasite. The end came with the kind of cinematic flair you usually only see in movies. Started with a knock on Maggie's door from the FBI's white-collar crime unit, while she was in the middle of a, end quote, compliance walk, end quote, through the neighborhood, and ending with her being led away in handcuffs while Silas and the rest of the neighbors stood on their lawns and clapped like it was the 4th of July. Her brother-in-law, the owner of the shell company, flipped on her faster than a pancake, providing the state's attorney with every forged invoice and kickback record we needed to seal the case. And as the news vans descended on Oak Haven Ridge, the, end quote, Judge versus HOA, end quote, story went viral, turning our little suburban drama into a national symbol of the fight against petty tyranny. At the final emergency community meeting, which had to be held in the local high school gym because so many people showed up, I stood on the stage not as a judge, but as a neighbor, and watched as the community voted unanimously to dissolve the old board and start fresh with a system of total transparency. We recovered the stolen funds through asset forfeiture, using the money to actually fix the pool, build a new playground, and even set up a legal defense fund for any resident who might face harassment in the future. And for the first time in years, the air in Oak Haven Ridge didn't in Oppos smell like Maggie's perfume. It just smelled like rain on hot asphalt, and the collective sigh of relief of a community that had finally found its spine. I'm still living in that corner house, and my privacy fence is finished, standing tall and sturdy, though I don an Oppos. Really need it as much as I thought I did because the neighbors are always stopping by to chat or share a beer while I work in my shop. And Silas even brought over a new mailbox that's twice as big and bright red, just to celebrate our win. It's funny how a man who spent 20 years looking for justice in a courtroom found the most satisfying verdict of his life right in his own backyard, proving that no matter how much power someone thinks they have, they're never above the law, especially when they're standing on the wrong side of a judge's property line. But it makes me wonder, how many of you out there are living under the thumb of a, end quote, Maggie Thorne, end quote, right now, feeling like you and Oppos, reattended in your own home, because some power-tripping board member decided they didn't end Oppos. Do you like your curtains or your politics? Is an HOA ever truly worth the, end quote, property value, end quote, they claim to protect, or is it just a breeding ground for the kind of petty corruption that can ruin a person's life if they don an Oppos? Do you have the resources to fight back? I want to hear your stories, the good, the bad, and the absolutely insane. So drop a comment below, and let's talk about whether it's time to rethink the way we govern our neighborhoods. And if you found this story as satisfying as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice finally being served. Because in the end, the only thing a bully can end Oppos stand is the truth, and we in Oppos. Read just getting started.